Dr. Roy Aranda obtained a degree from the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University in 1982, a 2-year postdoctoral degree in neuropsychology in 2001, and a law degree in 2007. He has been licensed in New York since 1983 and is president of Long Island Psychological Consulting, PC, with 3 offices. He performed hundreds of forensic evaluations and was an expert in several high-profile cases, including the Happy Land trial and New York terrorist trial. Dr. Aranda traveled extensively and made many presentations in the United States and abroad. He has written several articles and presently is writing 2 chapters that will be published in an edited book, Faces of Trauma in Forensic Contexts. One, immigration-related, Crossing the Wall, Perilous Journey of Hispanic Refugees in the United States. Dr. Aranda is president of the Association of Hispanic Mental Health Psychological Association. He received countless awards and recognitions, which include NYPSA's President's Award, the Ellen Williams Award, Prolific Community Activist, Hispanic Healthcare Advocate of the Year Award, inducted as a fellow into the National Academies of Practice Psychology Academy as a distinguished practitioner, NYSPA's Beacon Award as well. Dr. Aranda now is the host of a new hour-long talk show on Spanish language television network, Tribuna TV, and another show in English. So let's welcome our next speaker, Dr. Roy Aranda.
Thank you all. I'm glad that you're here. It was a very interesting journey for me. You know, not anywhere near the rigors some people face in coming across the southern border, but I still, I did have to come from Long Island, and it's still a perilous journey, making it to Brooklyn and trying to navigate Drawer Lemon and Livingston and Court and cops and corrections officers and who knows what. And I'm not sure where I'm parked, so we'll figure out that later. So I don't mind taking questions. The only thing, if you're going to ask a question, obviously I need to see your hand and I need to hear the question. I'm going to sort of switch things up a little bit, if you bear with me. I'm going to go real fast, real fast. So I'm going to start with visuals. Can anybody tell me why I've decided to skip across something like about 40 or 45 slides and start with visuals? Anybody want to venture a guess?
That's what's happening now.
Okay, it certainly is what's happening now. Anybody have an idea what this beautiful luxury quasi-Amtrak train is his name? Anybody?
La Bestia.
La famosa La Bestia, you got it. You definitely got it. That's pretty much what it looks like. You can see literally hundreds of people on top of it. This is how you get onto it. Okay, it's not like there's a platform and they say watch your step. You have to sort of like jump on and grab a ladder or whatever, hold on for dear life and get up to the top. And this is what I affectionately call the sleeping coach. Those are not sleeping bags. Those are probably garbage bags that some of these immigrants trying to make it to the border are depending on. Now you'll notice that there's no rails and you do have trees along the side. And what happens is that sometimes somebody falls off, is pushed off, loses balance. And of course, what we don't know too much here We hear about mareros. What are mareros? Where's my sister? ¿Qué son mareros?
The bad guys.
They're gangs, okay? Here you have the famous MS-13, but they're gang members, and they're very prevalent in Central America. You have quite a few of them. But in Mexico, along the freight train, you have a group, a gang, that's called Las Zetas, Z-E-T-A-S, the Z's. And they are mareros, and they will actually stop people, get them off, take shots at them, demand money, and if they don't get it, well, you know, it can be serious. So this is what the accommodations look like for children, okay? There's no pictures, no blankets. It's not like they have mattresses either. No windows, no comfort features in their children. You know, you don't see parents there, do you? There's no parents. So, you know, of course, we've heard some criticism and some mentions in the United States that, you know, this is not a jail. They're not held in jail cells that have bars like you see at Rikers Island. I'm not sure how much of a distinction you want to argue about these kids being behind chain link fences. More sleeping arrangements for the kiddies. Again, plastics to cover them, and again, you don't see teddy bears or anything on the walls. These are the makeshift, very quickly put up accommodations for the large masses of immigrants that are coming from the Northern Triangle. Mostly the Northern Triangle is Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. It's the Northern Triangle. And they travel having to cross Guatemala to get into Mexico. Mexico is huge. It's a huge, huge country. Very perilous along the way. So these are sort of like tent cities, and that's in Texas. More pictures of kids and families in detention centers. More of the accommodations. Closer up view of the tent city. What the Border Patrol looks like. This was when there was movement to deploy troops to the border, and this is what it looked like. And these are some makeshift detention centers and accommodations at the southern border now. So if we go back here, and then I'll go forward again. When you look at this, and you look at this, it's sort of, and this is why I wanted to start with the visuals, because when you're working with undocumented, or you're in some way doing a forensic evaluation, or you're in some way involved in working with these people, whether it be in school system, medical facilities, whether it be working with attorneys or with other psychologists or social workers or mental health professionals who provide some sort of service. And especially if you're going to be providing a report that's going to go to an immigration judge. When you have something that's in black and white, I can show you, this is like a report. You don't see a picture of the child or of the person who's involved in you doing an evaluation. There's no pictures. And when you're preparing a report, a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? You've heard that expression. I didn't invent that. Your job really is to, in some way, have feeling. You need to have some way of you yourself having a feeling for what's going on and what you're exposed to and what you're experiencing. Because how else are you going to be able to convey that in a report? You have to take your words and put them in a report and make those words vibrant. You have to put life to those words, and you have to put a description so that you're talking not about Mr. Jones in the abstract, but you're talking about Juan Jones. You're talking about what the person is like, what he looks like, what his life is like, what the child is like, what the child's feelings might be like. Obviously, you're seeing senses of sadness, probably depression when you look at these kinds of pictures. And somehow it's your job to be able not only to feel it yourself and to experience it, but to be able to convey that in the work that you do. Going again forward, some more of the pictures, and we're going to get somewhat dramatic. This is one of the caravans that was heading towards the southern border. Again, pictures of immigrants working their way towards the United States. Families. Here you see the children, you can actually see the faces, you can see what they look like. These are human beings, these are people, this is what they look like. These are their faces. Sleeping for the children. That little girl doesn't look too excited, does she? She doesn't look too happy. She looks scared. The father is desperately trying to cross that river, holding on to her to get to safety. This actually gives you a sense of what it's like, of the feeling behind it. Look at the huge bridge. That's Mexico. Huge bridge. There's a risk, of course, of falling off. And you do see people jumping.
Dr. Aranda, is there any idea of the percentage of these children are unaccompanied minors? Is there any idea?
I'm really not too sure. I know that the numbers were very, very large. Going back about 2 years ago, we had really 70, I think it was reaching 70,000. It was very, very large. Presently, it's difficult to get the statistics because we're not even aware accurately. Maybe somebody is. I'm not publicly. We're not terribly aware of how many separated children still are in the United States or where they are. And we're still not sure where the parents of all of the separated children are and what became of them. So the numbers are really very underestimated when we hear things. But I have to believe that it's probably larger than what we think, because there has been really no systematic way of tracking. You have different agencies that are responsible for doing something, and when it's out of their hands, it's over and done with. And I'm going to get back to that point as well, because there's a point that I want to make about where do you go after you make an intervention? What becomes after your intervention? Okay, this is probably the most dramatic picture that I have here. Okay? There's obviously fear, panic, and they're both children. Adults, children, crossing, treacherous crossing. These are asylum-seeking Central American families and minors. They're in makeshift detention areas waiting to be processed. This, by the way, is a gate And as you can see, it's not a wall, it is a gate. It's a fence. And here's a close-up. Here's a close-up. So there's actually an opening. And you have immigration officials that open the door and allow the immigrants to come through, and they check them. They check their there's a detention center, and they check them. I'm not illegal. I sort of jumped on a little bit. But they actually open up the gate and process them. You know, they ask for ID. Seeking asylum does not make you illegal, okay? I don't think anybody should carry a label of being illegal anyway. You know, you're not illegal. You perhaps may be undocumented. You know, you don't have the proper documentation. You're not an illegal. That's, to me, a very pejorative term. But seeking asylum and, crossing and saying that I'm a victim of brutal treatment in my country of origin, and I'm seeking asylum here, that's legal. You're not entering illegally when you do that. The reason that I put this, by the way, is, I figure I'll show off a little bit, but I do have a TV show, and it's not TV. There's the link at the top. The reason that I wanted to mention this right now is that yesterday I had a live show at 9 to 10 p.m. and my guest was Antonio E. Puente, who was president of the American Psychological Association in 2017. And we may have a new president-elect coming up in this room. Where are you? Virginia, New Year? Okay, maybe, we'll see. But he was my guest, and we were talking about the natural disasters and human-made tragedy. And the link will probably actually have the show. It's recorded. So if you're interested, you can probably actually see my interview with him later today. So now let's go more into the nuts and bolts of some of the things that I wanted to talk about. You already have the bio. Here's some definitions. These are basic legal definitions of what an alien is, an immigrant, a non-immigrant, an illegal alien, which is really an undocumented alien, and non-immigrant visas. Okay, so some terms for you. If some of you might be interested, I think maybe you know how to get a hold of me through the bio. Just let me know, and I can make some of these things available to you. What are some of the forms of relief? I'm going to focus mostly on asylum, since what we're seeing now at the southern border is a huge mass of families and children seeking asylum to escape horrific circumstances in their countries. But some of the basics for doing evaluations and some of the issues pertaining to how you go about doing evaluations and some of the concern, there's a big overlap. So hardship. This is something for those of you who work in the field that you'll be seeing a lot of. The hardship applies to the U.S. citizen or lawful resident who may lose a family member, who may lose a parent, a mother, a father, or a child who's not documented. So it's the hardship to that person. It's not the hardship to the person who's potentially facing the removal. You think it's their hardship, but the government is focused on the hardship to the U.S. citizen and to the resident. And there's legal standards that have to be attained. And certainly, one of the things that I would recommend and strongly urge anybody who's doing any sort of forensic work would know this. You need to know the law. You need to be familiar with the law, with the legal requirements. And you have to have some solid knowledge of working with attorneys. You don't have to have a law degree, but you do certainly have to have a lot of background in the area that you're doing evaluations in. U visa. This is something that applies to an undocumented person who has been in the United States was a victim of a qualifying crime and is working with the U.S. government towards convicting the person who committed that crime. So in exchange for that cooperation, a new visa may be granted, which allows after a couple of years for that person to seek residency in the United States. I've had as examples in workers' compensation cases, I've had undocumented women working in hotels or motels who were in some way sexually assaulted. And they were eligible for workers' compensation because it was work-related injury, but they also qualified for a possibility of a visa through an immigration attorney because of the violent qualifying crime. TVs is similar, but it applies to trafficking. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, the Violence Against Women Act, which applies to men and women, and it's basically somebody who is lawfully married or has had a relationship, a meaningful, real relationship, and was a victim of some form of domestic violence. Okay, special immigrant juvenile status, I won't get into this too much. Asylum, okay. There's 5 grounds for seeking asylum: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And the standard has to be that it has to be credible, there has to be a credible fear, and it also has to be that the country of origin is unable to protect you. So if you have a woman who was, let me sit down for a bit. If you have a woman who was the victim of a sexual offense or of a domestic violence offense, say in El Salvador, as a hypothetical, and that person, the perpetrator, maybe a police officer, or marero, or is affiliated with cops or mareros, and because of that, she reported to the police. They laughed it off. They didn't do anything. They didn't do anything to help her, to protect her. Then she had to flee. She did what she had to do to try to escape, and she was being looked for and threatened, and the guy said, if you say anything to me, I'm going to kill you, or I'll kill your kids, or I'll kill your family. And then she comes fleeing to the United States and requests asylum. So in considering this, you consider the story. There's a narrative. You have to look at the narrative. What's the story that the person is telling you? Does it seem credible? Does the story seem real? Narratives are very good. You know, you need to really get a thorough, detailed narrative over a period of time. It's consistent. You don't get too many deviations. There may be minor changes here and there. Our memory changes easily, readily, but you get a narrative. And the key is, you know, again, credible. As a psychologist, you may be administering or doing certain kinds of procedures or looking at tests to assess whether or not there's some indication of post-traumatic stress disorder or clinical depression or different forms of anxiety, or if there was a beating. I've had females who were run over by their husbands driving vehicles and ended up hospitalized and brain damaged. So do you do any traumatic brain injury kinds of testing? What are some of the things that you might need to do? But the report would somehow have to indicate that if this woman were to return to El Salvador, she fears that somehow, no matter where she goes, her husband, boyfriend, whatever, is somehow going to find her. through a marero or through cops or whatever, they're going to find her, and she's going to be killed or severely injured, okay? In airports and in places of transit, they do have people posted there. They look for the comings, who's coming, who's entering the country. So that's the basis, credible fear, and you cannot help those things. Asylum. U.S. is the top resettlement country in 2015, which is the most recent that I was able to come up with. We had asylum granted to over 26,000 people, and there were about 3.2 million asylum seekers. So here, just repetition, what I mentioned before. Oh, I'm going backwards, okay. All right. So the top countries, if you put El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico all together, together it beats anywhere else, okay? This is like the top percentage of asylees entering into the United States will come from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. There are two types of asylum applications. One is affirmative, meaning that the person, for instance, crossing the border, says, I'm here seeking asylum. That's affirmative. Defensive is if you were stopped, you were somehow picked up, so you now are defending your stay in the United States by raising an asylum petition. Just to give you some of the numbers, I mean, the 45-day government shutdown is only 3 months old, and, I'm sure it still stings many. We're looking at huge numbers in terms of the immigration courts. We had somewhere between 80,000 to 94,000 hearings were canceled during the shutdown, and a backlog of cases was 830,000 as of February 2019. My understanding from what I've been reviewing in the literature is that we're probably looking at cases stalled through 2022. Okay, that's how long it's going to take to move some of these cases. You saw some of the perils. Okay, I don't want to rehash this too much. We had the 2 children who died. These are some of the statistics that are there. Stereotypes. When you do your reports or you do your work or you're involved in working with any undocumented immigrants or even immigrants or people who are of Hispanic origin or other origins and who happen to have come to this country, maybe they have family members who are in harm's way. You have to consider what some of the stereotypes are. These are typical stereotypes. I know that through Dr. Dan Kaplan, what was it, about 2 years ago, we had a microaggressions seminar, which was pretty terrific, but you're looking at not only microaggressions, but macroaggressions and blatant forms of stereotype and prejudice. I'm not going to belabor this too much. How am I doing with time? Okay. Most of you, or raise your hand if you've had some exposure or experience with, or you know what PTSD is. Okay. So these are some typical symptoms that you'll see in PTSD. It's not exclusively in PTSD, and you can have these symptoms with or without PTSD. Not every person has a diagnosis just because you're working with them. You have to be very careful not to sit there and overdiagnose somebody, but you also don't want to misdiagnose. But these are some typical symptoms that are faced by adults. And some more stuff. I gave you quite a few here. Children, these are some typical symptoms that you'll see in children. Again, with PTSD, the criteria for children PTSD, you'll know is different than it is with adults. The requirements are different, the symptoms are different. You're also looking at developmental age of the child. There are developmental issues that are associated with their behaviors and their emotions as well. Some of the typical things I think that are really red flags, changes in school performance, behavioral changes, listlessness in school, anything that's a change. You know, you're going to see a change. That a change should be a red flag. In general, what's going on? You're not well today. Why are you still in bed? Why are you not wanting to go to school today? What happened to your report card? Where are you going? Why are you so late? You know, these are some things you need to focus on as parents and as siblings and older siblings and people who have family members that may in some way have been traumatized or are facing some sort of trauma. Changes, look for changes. Here's some immigration statistics. More than 9 million children in the United States, parents are undocumented immigrants, so you had asked for numbers. This gives you at least some sense of numbers that we're looking at. Half of these are United States citizens, 16 million lived in mixed status. Mixed status means that some parents are and some parents are not documented. Stressors that they face, relocations. Because of the relocations and financial shortcomings, you see problems with schooling. You see problems with their medical care. Okay, parents may be reluctant to take them someplace because of their documentation status. So they're living in the shadows a lot. So they're going to be receiving substandard medical care when they get it. They may not be receiving medical care because parents may not go for the medical care. They don't have insurance. They're relocating. They're financially struggling, and it's frequent relocations. You're also dealing with cultural and language barriers and stereotypes. These are some of the psychological tolls experienced by people who have some immigration-related source of stress. Of course, how nice the word ice, huh? Yeah, so, people are afraid they stay home. They're afraid that they're going to get stopped. I have many patients who are undocumented.
I just want to add to these children are receiving substandard education because immigrant parents are afraid to go to schools, afraid to ask for services as it relates to students with disabilities and special needs as well, afraid to even go and speak up and said, my child needs help. So along all these other things, very substandard education.
Yeah. Well, I've had situations where, and I read also, and I followed up in the news accounts where a mother going to pick up her child at school, and the mother's not documented on the way to school. She gets picked up by ICE. And when ICE picks you up, it's not like they leave a calling card or a name. It's not like you have any rights. It's not like when you are arrested of a crime, or well arrested, and charged with something. You have a right to an attorney, and you have a right to have your rights read to you, and to make a phone call. That's not the same thing with ICE. You have no rights. You can be whisked away and expeditiously deported. I mean, deportations can be as quickly as 48 hours. That's how quickly it can be. Child has no idea where you are. Family member has no idea what's going on. So it's something that I see people, they're fearing. They're afraid to go out. I have many patients who actually are requesting some immigration relief. And while they are in process of requesting immigration relief, they can't be harmed because they actually have proof that they're submitting papers and that they're in process of having a case heard in court. They don't care. They're still afraid. They're afraid of going out. They're afraid of being in cars. They're afraid of going on subway platforms, on large areas where they can be picked up and detained. Certainly the worst thing you can do is run away, because then you definitely will be picked up. I always tell people that I work with, and you should be sensitive to this as well, make sure that you have ID. You cannot have fraudulent ID, that's terrible. If you have fraudulent ID, all you're doing is adding significant problems to the mix if you're undocumented. It's just going to make matters worse. You're better off saying I don't have ID rather than showing phony ID. So some sort of valid ID or realistic ID and a plan. Like what happens if you don't see me by such and such a time? Who's going to take care of the case, who's going to do what, where, when, what's going to happen. That has to somehow be talked about and thought about. The impact of ICE. We had a 900% spike in New York City. The ICE arrest increased more than 40%. This is in 2017. This is the most recent statistic that I was able to come up with. Here you see some additional numbers. So here's the problem. If you look at 90% of detainees without lawyers end up losing their cases, that's horrible. But on the other hand, you don't have a right to an attorney. So if you are financially devastated, unemployed, living in the shadows, you don't think of this. There are legal resources and pro bono and low bono, and there's certainly things that you can do, but people need to somehow be aware of this through education. That's one of the things that I'm hoping to do with my TV show. I've talked about the immigration problem, and I try to put the word out to many of my listeners that there are things that you can do, and not to automatically believe that you have no help or that you need to hide, and always run away. Okay, children, children are not little adults. I mean, how many of you were old enough that you heard this nonsense that children are like little adults? How many? I mean, I have. I confess, I'm a little bit older than probably most of you, but I've heard that. Do you younger folks still hear this nonsense? Kids are just little adults. Okay, that's nonsense. Their brains are not fully developed until they're about 25 years old. For anybody who's into neuropsychology, you'll know that's pretty accurate. But again, you have different developmental stages. And by the way, neuropsychology does teach us, and we know this from scientific research, that when you have trauma, and it doesn't have to be that you had an insult to the brain, that you suffered a traumatic brain injury from a fall, a slip, an injury, but you suffer changes, brain changes, associated with stress, with chronic stress. It affects your brain. Okay, there are biological, biochemical, neuropsychological changes that take place in the brain with chronic stress. What do you think is going to happen to the children who are separated from their parents and have not been reunited with their parents? Okay, I think it's fairly safe to say that most of them are experiencing some sort of separation anxiety, PTSD-like symptoms, prolonged. They are going to have their brains will be affected. And we don't know scientifically yet to what extent they can bounce back. Can you recover from this? Can brain plasticity really come back after so many years of living in stress? Here's something we really don't have time to get into it. It's a model that I came up with, a 5-stage model for children going from the ground zero, point zero, the country of origin, what led them to leave, the journey, the experience coming to the border, crossing the border, what life was like here on this side of the border, and then what it was like once inside the United States, and what it's like if they have to return. So it's a 5-stage model that I had come up with. If you're interested, I can be more than glad to share it with you. These are some of the impact of children who are unaccompanied. Again, looking at the 5-stage model that I had. Crossing the border in the US, remaining in the United States, and entering school system. They don't speak English, so what happens? They're put back in school. They're special classes. They don't necessarily get the same type of education. DACA, I think that you probably heard some stuff about DACA next door with Dr. Kaplan before, and you're familiar with it. About 800,000 are affected. And these are pretty much adults by and large. Now they're adults. Many of them are professionals, and many of them didn't even know that they were undocumented, so that they had this problem. All of a sudden finding out now, oh my God, why didn't you tell me this? Like what to do with them. And how are you going to send somebody who's been 20 years here, back to the country from originally, they came from? They don't even speak necessarily the language, and they're certainly not culturally fluent with their country of origin anymore. The notion of the immigrant as a criminal is bogus. Okay, I gave you a link here, and here you can see an abstract. Research has shown little support for the enduring proposition that increases in immigration are associated with increases in crime. You can do Google search or come up with a lot of information that dispels this myth, this stereotype. We all, psychologists, social workers, nurses, psychiatrists, we have to abide by ethical standards and ethical mandates. We need to be aware of cultural differences. We have to be familiar with them. You don't have to be from the culture, but you have to be sensitive to it and realize that there are such things. So, I sort of want to end. What time is it?
10 to 12.
I just want to end very quickly by showing you that there are evaluation challenges. I'm sure you're familiar with things like validity and reliability and whether or not a particular test is appropriate or not, and valid, facially valid, construct validity. I'm not going to give you a lesson in it, but there's things that you need to consider. Cross-cultural comparisons, language differences, translated protocols. How do you know that the translated protocol that you're using is valid for the population that you're working with? How do you know who translated it? How was it translated? Be aware of those spontaneous translations when somebody goes to an IME appointment, independent medical evaluation, and the doctor is using the secretary as a translator, and the secretary is spontaneously translating into Spanish what he is saying, he or she is saying in English. That's not valid. Okay, so some more pitfalls. Same words may have different meanings. In English, a sentence can be defined as a group of words with a complete thought, right? But it's also, you go to Rikers Island, you have a sentence. You're completing your sentence at Rikers Island is the use of the sentence in two ways. In that sentence that I just gave you. Spanish doesn't have that. Okay, Spanish sentence frase and a criminal sentence is different. Una sentencia criminal. Frase, sentencia criminal are different. Also, look at the number of syllables. If you consider that in some tests, for instance, simple digit span, you have In English, one is one syllable. In Spanish, uno is two syllables. I gave you all of them. You know, going down from 1 to 0. Look at the number of syllables, English versus Spanish. Now here, repeat 1, 4, 5, 8, 9 in English. 1, 4, 5, 8, 9 is 5 syllables. In Spanish, 1, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10 syllables. Okay, as a hypothetical, could this in some way affect short-term immediate memory? If you're testing somebody who in Spanish and you're using a translator test and you think that the norms are the same, how do you go from 5 syllables to 10 syllables and not have any difference? Lastly, we have the alphabet. This is, trails. I'm sure many of you have seen trails. Look at the alphabet. You have A, B, C, D. In Spanish, you're missing che, C-H, ella, the double L, and the N with the squiggly line, the ñ. So if you are Spanish, and you are going from 1 to A to 2, 2 to B, B to 3, 3 to C, C to 4, and 4 to D, and you end. And you're doing it in Spanish, you're going 1 to B, 1 a B, B a 2, 2 a 3, 2 a C, C a 3, 3 a, where's the CH?
Che.
It's not there. Oh, they're kicking me out. Okay, so ICE is waiting. I got a wrap. I just wanted to point that out, okay? And actually, we did good because I came back to the first slide. That shows you. So hopefully you got something out of this. I'm reachable, and if you have any questions, contact me. If you want access to some of these slides, let me know as well. Thank you, Dan, for coordinating all of this.
Before you leave, we wanted to thank you. I don't know if Dr. Aranda said he's a former president of New York State Psychological Association. He is an incredible champion of diversity, incredible champion of psychology, and we wanted to thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Do you still